Every family has a box like this one. A cardboard box, soft at the corners, sealed with tape that has turned brown and brittle with age. Inside, there are photographs nobody has looked at in years, letters nobody has read, and small objects nobody quite remembers the meaning of anymore. For Mara Ellison, that box sat in the attic of her grandmother's house for as long as she could remember. She never opened it while her grandmother was alive. She never had a reason to. Her grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, passed away in early spring, 3 weeks before her 91st birthday. She died quietly in her sleep in the same house she had lived in for over 60 years. It was the kind of death people call peaceful, the kind that leaves behind grief, but not shock. Mara had expected it in the way you expect a long winter to end. What she had not expected was what she would find while clearing out the house. The task fell to her because she was the only grandchild who lived close enough to handle it. Her mother had passed years earlier, and her uncle lived 2 states away, busy with his own family and unwilling to take time off work. So it was Mara, alone, walking through the quiet rooms of a house that suddenly felt too large and too silent, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. The attic was the last room she touched. It took her almost a full day just to clear a path through the furniture, old holiday decorations, and boxes of clothes that had not fit anyone in decades. Near the back, tucked behind a rolled-up rug, she found the box. It was unmarked, except for a single word written in fading marker on the side: photos. She almost set it aside for later. She was tired, and the house still had 2 more rooms to go. But something about the box made her curious. Maybe it was the quiet of the house pressing in on her, or maybe it was simple grief looking for a distraction. She sat down on the dusty floor, pulled open the flaps, and began sorting through the photographs one by one. Most of them were exactly what she expected. Black and white pictures of relatives she recognized from other albums. Faded color photographs from the 70s and 80s, family barbecues, birthday parties, a wedding she vaguely remembered attending as a child. She smiled at some of them, paused at others, and felt the familiar ache of missing someone who was now gone. Then she found the photograph that would change everything. It was black and white, slightly curled at the edges, taken at what looked like a lake house. She recognized the porch immediately. It belonged to her family's old summer property, a place her grandmother had talked about often, but that had been sold long before Mara was born. In the photograph, a group of people stood together, smiling at the camera. She recognized her grandmother, much younger, maybe in her 20s, standing near the center. Beside her stood a man Mara assumed was her grandfather, though he had passed away before she was born, and she had only seen him in a handful of photographs. But there was another man in the picture. He stood close to her grandmother, his arm resting lightly near her shoulder, in the easy way of someone who belonged in the group. He was young, maybe 30, with dark hair combed neatly to the side and a calm, confident expression. Mara did not recognize him. She turned the photograph over, hoping for a name or a date, but the back was blank except for a faint half-erased pencil mark that she could not quite make out. She set the photograph aside and kept sorting, thinking little of it. Families often had photographs like this, friends of the family, neighbors, people whose names got lost over the years. But an hour later, she found another photograph from what appeared to be the same day. And the man was in that one too, standing in nearly the same position, smiling in the same easy way. By the time she finished going through the box, she had found the man in 4 different photographs, all taken at the lake house, all from what looked like the same gathering. In every single one, he stood close to her grandmother, not like a stranger being polite for a photograph, like family. Mara sat on the attic floor for a long time after that, holding the 4 photographs in her hands, staring at a face she had never seen before in her life. A face that, for reasons she could not explain, felt like it belonged in her family and yet did not belong there at all. She told herself it was nothing. A cousin, perhaps someone from her grandmother's side who had drifted away from the family over the decades, the way people sometimes do. But there was something about the way he stood, something about the ease in his posture, that made the explanation feel too simple. She could not shake the feeling that she was looking at someone who mattered, someone whose name had been deliberately left off the family record. She did not know it yet, but that quiet afternoon in the attic was the beginning of a search that would take her into the oldest and most carefully guarded parts of her family's history. It would lead her to letters no one had read in 50 years, to a name written only once, and to a truth her grandmother had kept hidden for her entire life. For now, all Mara had was a photograph, a stranger's face, and a question she could not stop asking herself. Who was this man, and why had no one in her family ever spoken of him? Welcome back to Shelby's Den, the place where we dig into the cases that never made national headlines, but absolutely should have. If you're new here, we cover unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and stories that fell through the cracks of true crime coverage. So if that's your thing, hit subscribe and ring that bell, because we've got a lot more of these coming. Now, let's get back to the story. The next morning, Mara brought the photographs downstairs and placed them on the kitchen table, the same table where her grandmother had served her tea 100 times before. She made coffee, sat down, and studied the pictures again in the better light of day, hoping the answer would somehow be more obvious now that she was not staring at them in a dusty attic. It was not. She examined the man's face closely. He had a straight nose, a strong jaw, and eyes that seemed to catch the camera directly, as though he was comfortable being photographed, comfortable being seen. His clothing suggested the early 1960s, which matched the general style of the other photographs in the box. He looked, if anything, like he could have been a distant relative of her grandmother, someone who might share a family resemblance if you looked closely enough. But when Mara compared his face to photographs of her grandmother's known brothers and cousins, she found no clear match. She decided to call her Aunt Diane, her grandmother's younger sister, who was 84 years old and still sharp enough to remember details from decades earlier. If anyone would recognize the man, it would be her. Diane answered on the third ring, her voice warm but tired, the way voices get after a loss like this one. I found some old photographs from the lake house, Mara said, after the usual greetings. There's a man in a few of them that I don't recognize. I was hoping you might know who he is. There was a pause on the line, longer than Mara expected. What does he look like? Diane finally asked. Mara described him as best she could. Dark hair, calm expression, standing close to Elena in each photograph. She mentioned the porch, the lake house, the way the group was arranged like it was a celebration of some kind. Another pause. I don't know who that would be, Diane said, but something in her voice had changed. It was quieter now, more careful. There were a lot of people who used to come around back then. Neighbors, friends of your grandfather's, it could be anyone. Mara pressed a little further, describing the way the man stood, the familiarity in his posture. She asked if perhaps he was a cousin from a branch of the family she did not know well. I really don't know, Diane said again, and this time there was a firmness in her tone that closed the door on the conversation. It was a long time ago, sweetheart. Not everything gets remembered. They spoke for a few more minutes about unrelated things, and then said their goodbyes. Mara set the phone down and sat quietly at the table, staring at the photographs. Diane's answer had been reasonable enough. It had been over 60 years. People forget faces, names, entire friendships that once felt important. But something about the pause before her answer, The sudden change in her tone stayed with Mara long after the call ended. Over the following days, she reached out to other relatives. She called her uncle, who barely looked at the photograph before saying he had no idea who the man was and that he had never heard of anyone matching that description. She messaged a second cousin who had once been close with the family and was known for keeping detailed notes on the family tree. Even she, with her carefully organized spreadsheets and photo archives, came back with nothing. It was her cousin Rebecca, closer to Mara's own age but with a habit of listening carefully to older relatives at family gatherings, who gave her the first real thread to pull. "You should ask Great Aunt Josephine," Rebecca said during a phone call one evening. "She's the oldest one left. If anyone remembers something from that far back, it would be her." Josephine was Eleanor's cousin, well into her 90s, living in an assisted living facility 2 hours away. Mara had not spoken to her in years, but she remembered her as sharp-tongued and observant, someone who had always seemed to know more about the family than she let on. Mara arranged a visit for the following weekend. The facility was quiet, clean, and smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. Josephine was sitting by a window when Mara arrived, a blanket over her knees, watching birds and a feeder outside. She brightened at the sight of Mara, though it took her a moment to place exactly who she was. After a few minutes of small talk, Mara took out the photographs and placed them gently in Josephine's lap. "I found these while clearing out Grandma's house," she said. "There's a man in them I don't recognize. I was hoping you might." Josephine picked up the top photograph, held it close to her face, and studied it for a long moment. Her expression, which had been soft and pleasant only seconds before, shifted into something Mara could not quite name. Not confusion. Something closer to recognition, followed immediately by discomfort. "Where did you say you found these?" Josephine asked, her voice suddenly quieter. "In a box in the attic." They were with the other photographs from the lake house. Josephine set the photograph down on her lap, face up, and stared out the window instead of looking at Mara. "Some things," she said slowly, "were better left in a box in the attic." Mara felt her pulse quicken. "Aunt Josephine, do you know who he is?" There was a long silence. Josephine's hands, resting on the blanket, had begun to tremble slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You should ask your grandmother," she said. "Except you can't, can you? Not anymore." She would say nothing else about the man that day, no matter how gently Mara asked. But before Mara left, Josephine took her hand and held it tightly, her eyes suddenly wet. "Whatever you find," she said, "remember that your grandmother was a good woman. Whatever happened, she carried it because she had to, not because she wanted to." Mara left the facility with more questions than she had arrived with, and one clear certainty settling heavily in her chest. Whoever this man was, her family had not simply forgotten him. They had chosen to forget him, and someone still remembered exactly why. Driving home from the assisted living facility, Mara could not stop replaying Josephine's words in her mind. Whatever happened, she carried it because she had to. It was not the answer of someone confused by old age. It was the answer of someone protecting a secret that had outlived the person who created it. She decided that if her family would not tell her who the man was, she would find another way to learn his name. The lake house had belonged to a small town called Ashford Hollow, a place with a population that had likely never exceeded a few thousand people, even at its busiest. Mara remembered her grandmother mentioning the town's local newspaper once or twice over the years, usually in passing, usually with a fondness that seemed to belong to a much simpler time. If the gathering in the photographs had been any kind of notable event, even a small one, there was a chance it had been mentioned somewhere in the newspaper's archives. She spent an evening searching online and found that the newspaper, though long out of print, had its old archives digitized and hosted through a regional historical society. The website was outdated, the search function clumsy, but it was something. She typed in the approximate year she believed the photographs were taken, based on the clothing and the general condition of the images, somewhere around 1962. She scrolled through page after page of local announcements, church notices, and advertisements for products that no longer existed. It was slow, tedious work, but she kept going, driven by the same restless curiosity that had kept her up the night before. Then, in the community section of a July 1962 edition, she found a small announcement. It was only a few lines long, easy to miss if she had not been looking so carefully. The Whitfield family of Ashford Hollow hosted a summer gathering at their lake property this past weekend, welcoming family and friends for what has become an annual tradition. Among those in attendance were several members of the extended Whitfield family, along with close friends of the household. There was no list of names, no mention of the man in the photographs, but the timing matched and the location matched, and for the first time, Mara felt like she was standing at the edge of something real, something that had actually happened, rather than chasing a face in an old photograph. She kept searching, moving forward through the following weeks of the newspaper's archive, hoping for a follow-up mention, perhaps a name buried in some unrelated article. It took her nearly 2 hours before she found it, in the classified section of a September edition from the same year. It was a short notice, easy to overlook among advertisements for farm equipment and household goods. Thomas Hawley, formerly of Ashford Hollow, has relocated to the city to pursue further work. Friends wishing him well may reach him through his sister, Margaret Hawley, at the address below. Mara stared at the name for a long time. Thomas Hawley. It meant nothing to her. No bells of recognition, no connection to any name she had heard in the family before. But something about the timing, only 2 months after the gathering at the lake house, made her chest tighten with a feeling she could not fully explain. She searched the newspaper archive for any earlier mention of Thomas Hawley, hoping to understand who he had been to the town, to the family, before the quiet announcement of his departure. It took another hour of searching before she found something. A photograph, printed small and grainy in a 1958 edition, showed a group of young men standing outside what appeared to be the local church, dressed for what the caption described as a community fundraising event. Among the names listed beneath the photograph, she found him. Thomas Hawley, third from the left, described only as a longtime resident of Ashford Hollow, active in local charity work. She compared the grainy newspaper photograph to the man in her grandmother's photographs. The image quality was poor, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Same dark hair, same straight nose, same easy confidence in his posture. She finally had a name. But the name only opened up more questions than it answered. Why had Thomas Hawley been standing so close to her grandmother in a family photograph in a way that suggested he belonged there? And why, only 2 months after that photograph was taken, had he suddenly left the town entirely, quietly, with only a brief classified notice marking his departure? Mara sat back from her laptop, the glow of the screen the only light in her dark living room, and felt the same unsettling certainty she had felt at Josephine's window. Something had happened that summer at the lake house. Something significant enough that a man who had lived his whole life in a small town suddenly packed up and left within weeks of a single photograph being taken. And whatever it was, it had been significant enough that 60 years later, her family still refused to speak his name. She had a name now, Thomas Hawley, but she still did not have his story, and she was beginning to suspect that finding it would require digging much deeper than old newspapers and half-remembered family gatherings. She needed to find someone who had actually known him, and she was running out of time before the people who remembered him firsthand were gone for good, just as her grandmother now was. With a name in hand, Mara returned to her grandmother's house the following weekend, determined to search it more thoroughly than she had before. If Thomas Holly had meant something to Eleanor Whitfield, there might be more evidence of him somewhere in the house, something beyond a handful of photographs in an attic box. She began in her grandmother's bedroom, the place that felt most personal, most likely to hold whatever private things Eleanor had chosen to keep close rather than store away. She went through the dresser drawers, the nightstand, the closet, finding nothing but ordinary items: clothing, jewelry, old greeting cards from grandchildren. It was almost by accident that she noticed a loose floorboard. She had knelt down to retrieve a fallen picture frame from beside the bed when she noticed a slight gap in the wood flooring, a place where one board sat just a fraction higher than the others around it. She pressed on it out of curiosity, and it shifted slightly beneath her fingers. Her heart began to beat faster as she worked her fingers into the small gap and lifted the board free. Beneath it was a shallow space, clearly built deliberately rather than the result of ordinary wear. And inside that space sat a small wooden box, its surface darkened with age. Mara lifted it out carefully and sat down on the edge of the bed, holding it in her lap for a long moment before opening it. Inside were letters, a small stack of them, tied together with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. There was also a single photograph, separate from the others, showing only Eleanor and Thomas Holly together, standing close, both of them smiling in a way that felt different from the posed group photographs Mara had already found. This one felt private, intimate, the kind of photograph someone keeps not to remember an event, but to remember a person. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were dated across a span of only a few months in the summer and early fall of 1962. They were written in careful, looping handwriting, and it did not take Mara long to understand who had written them. The first letter began simply: "Eleanor, I know what we are doing is wrong in the eyes of everyone who matters to us both, but I have never felt as certain of anything as I feel of this." Mara read on, her chest tightening with each line. The letters revealed a relationship between Eleanor and Thomas Holly that had clearly gone far beyond friendship. They spoke of stolen afternoons by the lake, of plans discussed in whispers, of a love that both of them seemed to understand could never be openly acknowledged. The reason became clear a few letters in. Eleanor was already engaged to be married. Her fiancé, a man named Walter Whitfield, was the same man Mara had always known as her grandfather. The letters continued, growing more urgent, more desperate as the summer progressed. Thomas wrote of wanting to leave together, of building a life somewhere far from Ashford Hollow, where no one would know their names or their history. Eleanor's responses, which Thomas had apparently returned to her at some point, revealed a woman torn between love and duty, between the life she wanted and the life that had already been decided for her by her family and by the expectations of the time. One letter, dated in early September of that year, was different from the others. Shorter, colder. "I cannot do what you are asking of me. My family has already made the arrangements, and to break them now would bring a shame upon them that I could never forgive myself for causing. I am asking you, for both our sakes, to let this end quietly. Please do not write to me again." Mara sat with that letter in her hands for a long time, understanding now why Thomas Holly had left Ashford Hollow so suddenly, so quietly, only weeks after that final photograph was taken at the lake house. He had not left because he wanted to. He had left because Eleanor had asked him to. But there was one more letter in the box, tucked beneath all the others, and it was not written in Thomas's handwriting. It was written in Eleanor's. The letter was addressed to no one meant it seemed, only for herself. It was undated, though the paper looked slightly newer than the others, suggesting it had been written some time after the affair had ended. "I made the right choice for my family," Eleanor had written. "I know that. Walter has given me a good life, a life I do not regret. But there are nights I still think of Thomas and of the child we never spoke of, and I wonder if the right choice and the good choice were ever truly the same thing." Mara read that final line 3 times before its full meaning settled over her. The child we never spoke of. She sat frozen on the edge of her grandmother's bed, the letters trembling slightly in her hands, understanding now that the story she had stumbled into was far larger and far more painful than a simple forgotten photograph. Somewhere, if the letter was to be believed, there had been a child connected to Thomas Hawley and to Eleanor, and to a secret that had apparently been kept from the rest of the family for over 60 years. Mara did not know yet who that child was or what had become of them, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that she could not stop searching now. Not when she was this close to understanding who her grandmother truly had been beneath the quiet, dignified woman Mara thought she had known her entire life. Mara drove back to the assisted living facility 2 days later, the letters carefully packed in a folder on the passenger seat. She had not called ahead this time. She was worried that if she gave Josephine time to prepare, the older woman would find a way to close the conversation before it even began. Josephine was in the same chair by the window when Mara arrived, though this time she did not smile at the sight of her. "You found something," Josephine said, before Mara had even sat down. It was not a question. Mara opened the folder and set the letters on the small table between them, along with the private photograph of Eleanor and Thomas standing close together. She watched Josephine's face carefully as the older woman looked over the items, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly softening into something that looked like grief. "I always wondered if she kept anything," Josephine said quietly. "I told her once, years ago, that she should burn everything. She never listened to me about much, but I thought for certain she had listened about that." "You knew about Thomas Hawley," Mara said. Josephine nodded slowly. Everyone who was old enough at the time knew, in one way or another. Not everyone spoke of it, but people knew. "And the child?" Mara said, her voice quieter now. "Do you know what happened to the child?" Josephine was silent for a long moment, her hands folding together in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on the careful, measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in her mind, even if she had never expected to actually have it out loud. "Eleanor was already several weeks along when she married Walter," Josephine said. "I do not know if Walter ever knew that, or if he simply never asked the kinds of questions that would have made him uncomfortable to know the answer to. But the timing was never right, not if you understood what had happened that summer. So the child was Thomas's," Mara said slowly, "but was raised believing Walter was the father." "That is what I always believed," Josephine said. "Eleanor never confirmed it to me directly, but I was there. I remember the wedding being moved up earlier than originally planned. I remember the whispers among the older women in the family, the ones who could count months on their fingers well enough to notice things." Mara felt her thoughts spinning, trying to work through the implications of what Josephine was telling her. If this was true, if the timeline matched what Josephine remembered, then the child Eleanor had written about in that final private letter was not some distant relative or family friend. The child was Mara's own parent, or an aunt or uncle she had grown up believing was fully a Whitfield by blood. "Which of them?" Mara asked carefully, almost afraid of the answer. "Was the child?" Josephine looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Your uncle," she said quietly, "Richard. He was born only 7 months after the wedding. though everyone was always careful never to mention that detail out loud. Walter raised him as his own son, gave him his name, never treated him any differently than he treated his other children who came after. Whatever Walter knew or suspected, he never let it change how he loved that boy. Mara sat back in her chair, absorbing the weight of what she had just learned. Her Uncle Richard, the man she had known her entire life as her grandfather's son, was possibly not her grandfather's biological son at all. He was, if Josephine's memory could be trusted, the son of Thomas Hawley, a man who had been quietly erased from the family's history the moment his relationship with Eleanor had ended. Does Richard know? Mara asked. I have no idea, Josephine said. Eleanor never spoke to me about telling him, and I never asked. Some secrets, once they are buried deeply enough, become easier to leave buried than to dig back up. I imagine that is exactly what Eleanor believed right up until the day she died. Mara thought of her uncle, the quiet, steady man who lived 2 states away, who had seemed almost relieved when Mara offered to handle their mother's house so he would not have to face the emotional weight of it himself. She wondered now if part of his reluctance to help had been about more than simple busyness. She wondered if some part of him had always sensed there were things in that house he did not want to find. What happened to Thomas after he left? Mara asked. Do you know? Josephine shook her head slowly. I know he moved to the city, as the newspaper said. Beyond that, I never heard anything more. Eleanor certainly never spoke of him again. Not to me, not to anyone I ever heard of. As far as this family was concerned, Thomas Hawley simply stopped existing the day he left Ashford Hollow. Mara gathered the letters back into their folder, her hands steadier now than they had been on the drive over, though her mind was anything but calm. She thanked Josephine for her honesty, and the older woman took her hand once more before she left, gripping it with surprising strength. Be careful with this, Josephine said. Whatever you decide to do with what you have learned, remember that Richard is still alive to be hurt by it. Eleanor is gone. Thomas, most likely, is gone as well by now. But your uncle is not, and he has spent his entire life believing a story that may not be entirely true. Mara nodded, though she was not yet certain what she intended to do with the truths she had uncovered. She had come looking for the identity of a stranger in an old photograph. She had not expected to find a secret capable of reshaping her own family's understanding of itself, or a living man who might still be waiting somewhere for a truth he had never been given the chance to know. Driving home from Josephine's facility, Mara found herself thinking less about her uncle and more about Thomas Hawley himself. If he had truly been forced out of the only town he had ever known, separated from a woman he loved and a child he may never have even known existed, what had become of the rest of his life? She decided she needed to find out. Using the name from the old newspaper notice, along with the address listed for his sister Margaret Hawley, Mara began searching public genealogy records online. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience and a willingness to follow small threads that often led nowhere. But after several evenings of searching, she found a record that made her sit up straight in her chair. A Thomas Hawley, born in the same year and same general region as the man in the photographs, had passed away nearly 20 years earlier, in a small city several hours from Ashford Hollow. The record listed a surviving daughter named Susan Hawley Whitcomb. Mara stared at the screen for a long moment. If this was the same Thomas Hawley, it meant he had gone on to marry, to have a family of his own, to build an entire life separate from the one he had once hoped to share with Eleanor. It also meant there was a woman still living somewhere who might be able to tell Mara things that no letter or newspaper archive ever could. It took another few days of searching, cross-referencing addresses and old public records, before Mara found a phone number she believed belonged to Susan Whitcomb. She sat with the number for an entire evening before finally working up the courage to call. A woman's voice answered on the fourth ring, warm but cautious. The voice of someone unaccustomed to receiving calls from unfamiliar numbers. Mara introduced herself carefully, explaining that she was researching her family's history and believed there might be a connection between their families, going back to a man named Thomas Hawley, who had once lived in a town called Ashford Hollow. There was a long pause on the line. "That was my father," Susan finally said. "He never talked much about that town. I always got the sense something happened there that he wasn't proud of, or maybe something that hurt him too much to talk about. He left when he was young and never went back, not even to visit." Mara's heart was pounding now. She explained, as gently as she could, that she had found old photographs of her grandmother and Thomas together, and letters suggesting a relationship between them that had ended painfully around the same time Thomas left Ashford Hollow for good. Susan was quiet for a long moment. "He kept a photograph," she finally said. "One photograph in a drawer in his study that he never explained and never let anyone touch. After he passed, I found it while going through his things. A young woman standing by a lake, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. I always wondered who she was." "I think that might have been my grandmother," Mara said quietly. They spoke for almost an hour after that, each of them filling in pieces of a story the other had only known fragments of. Susan explained that her father had eventually married her mother several years after leaving Ashford Hollow, that he had been a good father, hardworking and quiet, but that there had always been a distance in him, a sadness that never fully seemed to leave, no matter how content his life became on the surface. "He used to say," Susan told her, "that the hardest thing a person can do is walk away from something they love because someone else asked them to. I never understood exactly what he meant by that until now." Mara hesitated before sharing the final piece of the story, the part about the child Eleanor had written of in her private letter. She was not certain it was her place to share something so significant over a phone call with a woman she had only just met. But she also felt that Susan, more than anyone else, deserved to know the full truth of what her father may have lost. She explained carefully what Josephine had told her about the timing of the wedding, about the child born only 7 months later, about the possibility that Thomas Hawley had a son he never knew existed. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Mara worried the call had dropped. "My father spent his whole life," Susan finally said, her voice thick with emotion, wondering if there had been a child. "He mentioned it to me once, very late in his life, when he was no longer well enough to hide his regrets as carefully as he once had. He said he always suspected there might have been, but that he had no way of knowing for certain, and no right to go looking after everything that had happened." "He suspected," Mara repeated softly. "He did," Susan said. "And now I suppose we both know he was right to." They agreed to speak again soon, both of them still absorbing the weight of what they had just learned about two people who had loved each other, lost each other, and spent the rest of their lives quietly carrying that loss without ever fully speaking of it to the families they went on to build. Mara ended the call and sat in the quiet of her living room for a long time afterward, thinking of two elderly people, long gone now, who had once stood together on a porch by a lake, smiling for a photograph neither of them could have known would someday reveal the truth they had spent a lifetime trying to keep hidden. She still had one more difficult conversation ahead of her, the most difficult one of all. She had to decide whether to tell her Uncle Richard the truth about who his real father had been. Mara did not make the decision lightly. She spent nearly 2 weeks turning the question over in her mind before finally deciding that Richard deserved to know, even if the truth might be painful. It was, after all, his story as much as it was Eleanor's or Thomas's. He had lived his entire life without ever being given the chance to understand where he had truly come from. She drove the 4 hours to his house on a quiet Saturday morning, the folder of letters and photographs resting on the passenger seat once again, now grown heavier with the addition of notes from her conversation with Susan. Richard greeted her warmly at the door, the way he always did, though there was a flicker of concern in his expression when he saw the folder tucked under her arm. "You look like you have something serious to talk about," he said, leading her into the kitchen. Mara sat across from him at his table and took a slow breath before beginning. She started with the photograph in the attic, the stranger standing beside Eleanor. She explained the newspaper search, the discovery of Thomas Hale's name, and the letters hidden beneath the floorboard in their grandmother's bedroom. Richard listened quietly, his expression shifting slowly from mild curiosity to something more guarded as the story continued. When Mara finally reached the part about the timing of his birth, about what Josephine remembered from that summer so long ago, he set his coffee cup down carefully and stared at the table for a long moment without speaking. "You're telling me," he said finally, his voice low, "that Dad might not have been my real father." "I'm telling you what Josephine remembered and what the letters suggested," Mara said gently. "I don't have absolute proof, but the timing lines up. And Thomas himself apparently suspected it too, according to his daughter." Richard was quiet for a long time after that. Mara did not push him, understanding that this was not the kind of information a person could simply absorb in a single conversation. She sat with him in the silence, letting him process it at his own pace. "He never treated me any differently," Richard finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, Walter, whatever the truth is about where I came from, he never once made me feel like anything less than his son." "From everything I found," Mara said, "it sounds like that was exactly the kind of man he was. Whatever he knew or suspected, he chose to love you fully anyway." Richard nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, clearly caught between grief and something that looked almost like gratitude. "Do you have a picture of him?" he asked. "Of Thomas?" Mara slid the private photograph across the table, the one of Elena and Thomas standing close together by the lake. Richard picked it up carefully, studying the man's face for a long time. "I look like him," he said quietly, "around the eyes. I never noticed it before because I never had anyone to compare myself to." They talked for hours after that, going through every letter, every photograph, every detail Mara had uncovered over the past several weeks. Richard asked question after question. Some of them Mara could answer, many of them she could not. By the time evening fell, he seemed lighter somehow, as though a question he had never consciously known he was carrying had finally been given an answer, even an incomplete one. "Do you think I should reach out to her?" he asked. "Susan, my half-sister, I suppose?" "I think that's entirely up to you," Mara said, but she seemed like she would welcome it. She spent her whole life wondering the same things you probably have, without ever knowing your name or whether you existed at all. Richard sat with that thought for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I'd like that," he said. "I think I'd like that very much." Before Mara left that evening, Richard walked her to her car, the folder of letters now resting safely in his own hands instead of hers. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I know it would have been easier to just leave it buried, the way everyone else clearly wanted to. I thought about it," Mara admitted, "but it didn't feel right, keeping something this important from you. Not when it was your own story." Richard hugged her tightly before she got into her car, and as she drove away, watching his house grow smaller in her rearview mirror, she felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering sadness. Relief, because the truth was finally out, no longer buried beneath a floorboard or hidden in the careful silence of relatives too afraid to speak of it. Sadness, because that truth had cost two people, Eleanor and Thomas, an entire lifetime of quiet longing they had never been able to resolve. But there was still one more thing left to do, one final piece of the story that Mara felt compelled to complete before she could truly consider the mystery closed. She wanted to see the lake house, the place where all of this had begun, one final time. The property had been sold decades earlier, long before Mara was born, passed through several owners over the years. She was not certain what she expected to find there, only that she felt a pull to see the place in person, to stand where her grandmother and Thomas Hawley had once stood together, smiling for a photograph that would eventually unravel a secret kept for 60 years. She drove out to Ashford Hollow on a quiet weekday afternoon, the town smaller and quieter now than the old newspaper archives had suggested it once was. Many of the old buildings were gone, replaced by newer, more modern structures, though a handful of older homes still stood along the main street, weathered but proud. She found the lake easily enough, its shoreline largely unchanged despite the passage of so many years. The current owners of the old Whitfield property, a retired couple named the Grangers, were kind enough to let her walk the grounds when she explained, briefly, that her family had once owned the house. The porch was still there, rebuilt at some point over the decades, but standing in roughly the same place as it had in the old photographs. Mara stood where she believed Eleanor and Thomas must have stood, looking out over the same stretch of water they would have seen together that summer so long ago. She took a single photograph on her phone, the lake calm and quiet in the afternoon light, and found herself thinking of the two people whose love had once bloomed and ended in this exact place. She thought of Eleanor, torn between duty and desire, choosing the life that was expected of her over the life she may have truly wanted. She thought of Thomas, carrying a photograph in a drawer for the rest of his life, never fully explaining to anyone why it mattered so much to him. She thought, too, of her own uncle, who had lived over 6 decades not knowing the full truth of where he came from, and who now, for better or worse, finally understood. As she stood there by the water, Mara found herself reflecting on how easily an entire history could be buried by a single choice, a single conversation never had, a single truth left unspoken for the sake of protecting a family's reputation. She thought of how close this story had come to disappearing entirely, lost forever the moment Eleanor herself passed away, if not for a single dusty box left behind in an attic. She wondered how many other families carried secrets just like this one, hidden behind ordinary photographs, waiting patiently for someone curious enough or brave enough to finally ask the right questions. Before leaving Ashford Hollow, Mara visited the small local cemetery, curious whether any record of the Hawley family might still remain there. She found Margaret Hale's grave easily enough, weathered but legible, tucked into a quiet corner beneath an old oak tree. There was no marker for Thomas himself, which made sense, given that he had passed away in the city where he eventually settled, far from the town that had once quietly asked him to disappear. She stood at Margaret's grave for a few minutes, feeling an unexpected wave of gratitude toward a woman she had never met, a woman who had apparently helped her brother start over somewhere, new after his life in Ashford Hollow had been so abruptly and painfully ended. Driving home that evening, the lake fading into her rearview mirror the same way Richard's house had faded away days earlier, Mara felt the investigation finally settling into something resembling peace. She had uncovered a secret her family had buried for 60 years. She had brought a long-lost connection back into the light, reuniting, in a small but meaningful way, two branches of a family that circumstance and fear had once torn apart. But there was still one final step remaining, one Mara felt was necessary, not just for her uncle's sake or for Susan's, but for her own understanding of the family she had grown up believing she fully knew. She needed to arrange a meeting. Richard and Susan, brother and sister, needed the chance to finally meet each other in person. The meeting took place 2 months later, in a quiet restaurant roughly halfway between Richard's home and Susan's, chosen deliberately as neutral ground for a moment that felt too significant to rush or force into anyone's comfort zone. Mara arrived early, nervous in a way she had not expected to be, given that the reunion was not technically her own. She had spoken with both Richard and Susan individually many times over the past 2 months, helping coordinate the details, answering questions each of them had for the other before they felt ready to meet in person. But nothing could have fully prepared any of them for the moment Richard walked through the restaurant door and saw Susan sitting at the table for the first time. They stood there for a long moment, simply looking at each other, both of them clearly searching for signs of a father and mother they had known in very different ways, across very different lives. "You have his eyes," Susan finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "You have his smile," Richard replied. "I saw it in the photographs you sent me." They embraced then, tightly, the kind of embrace that carries the full weight of everything that could have been but never was, and everything that still remained possible now that the truth had finally found its way into the light. Mara watched from a few steps away, feeling like an intruder on something deeply personal, though both Richard and Susan quickly pulled her into the moment as well, thanking her repeatedly for the persistence that had brought them together after a lifetime of not even knowing the other existed. They sat together for hours that afternoon, sharing stories about the parents who had raised them, the very different lives they had lived, and the strange, quiet sadness both Eleanor and Thomas had apparently carried with them for the rest of their lives, never fully able to explain to their own families exactly why. "He used to stare at that photograph sometimes," Susan said at one point, tears in her eyes. "I would catch him in his study, just looking at it, and he would quickly put it away if he noticed me watching. I always thought it was just an old memory he'd like to revisit. I never imagined it was something this significant." "Grandma was the same way," Mara added quietly. "Aunt Josephine told me she never spoke of Thomas again after he left. But she kept those letters hidden beneath a floorboard for 60 years. Some things, I suppose, are too important to fully let go of, even when you feel like you have no choice but to try." Richard reached across the table and took Susan's hand gently. "I'm glad Mara found that photograph," he said. "I spent my whole life feeling like there was something slightly out of place about my own story, something I could never quite name. Now I finally understand what that feeling was." Susan nodded, wiping at her eyes. "My father used to say that some love stories don't get the ending they deserve, but that doesn't mean they don't matter. I think he would have been glad to know this ending finally came, even 60 years later." By the time they parted ways that evening, exchanging phone numbers and promises to visit each other's families soon, Mara felt the quiet satisfaction of having helped complete a story that had almost been lost entirely. She thought of her grandmother, a woman she had loved deeply and thought she fully understood, and realized that even the people we know best can carry entire hidden chapters within them, chapters shaped by choices made long before we were born, choices we may never fully understand unless something or someone forces those old truths back into the light. Driving home that night, Mara found herself thinking of the box in the attic, the one she had almost set aside without opening. She thought of how close this entire story had come to disappearing forever, buried beneath decades of silence and an old family's careful insistence that some things were better left forgotten. She was deeply grateful in that quiet moment that she had chosen to open it anyway. In the months that followed, Mara found herself thinking often about the true meaning of that first photograph she had discovered in her grandmother's attic. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than an old picture of a stranger standing among family members at a summer gathering. She had almost dismissed it entirely, almost let it slip quietly back into the box where it had been hidden for 60 years. Instead, it had led her to a truth far larger than she ever could have imagined. A love story cut short by duty and fear. A child raised without ever knowing his true origins. A man who spent the rest of his life quietly mourning a choice that was never fully his own to make. And a woman, her own grandmother, who carried the weight of that choice silently for the remainder of her life, choosing love for her family over love for herself, and living with the quiet grief of that decision until the very end. Mara often wondered what Eleanor would have thought, knowing that her private letters had eventually been found, that her secret had finally been brought into the light so many years after her passing. She hoped, in the end, that her grandmother would have understood that some truths, however painful, deserved to be known rather than buried. That the people left behind deserved the chance to understand where they truly came from, even if that understanding arrives decades later than it should have. Richard and Susan continued building their relationship in the months that followed, slowly becoming as close as any siblings who had grown up together. Despite the 60 years and hundreds of miles that had once separated their entirely different lives. Richard often said that finding Susan had given him a sense of completeness he had not even realized was missing. A quiet peace that settled the restless, unnamed feeling he had carried with him for as long as he could remember. As for Mara, she kept a box of letters and photographs, no longer hidden beneath a floorboard, no longer sealed away in an attic, but displayed openly in her own home, a quiet reminder of the family history she had helped uncover. She often looked at the photograph that had started it all, the image of a stranger standing close to her grandmother on a porch by a lake, and felt a deep sense of gratitude that she had chosen curiosity over convenience, truth over comfortable silence. She thought, too, of all the other families out there, all the other boxes tucked away in attics and closets across the world, holding photographs of strangers no one remembers, letters no one has read in decades, secrets waiting patiently to be uncovered by someone curious enough to ask the right questions. Not every family carries a secret as significant as the one Mara uncovered, but every family, she came to believe, carries some version of a hidden truth, some quiet story left unspoken for the sake of protecting the people involved. Sometimes those truths remain buried forever, lost the moment the last person who remembers them passes away. And sometimes, if someone is willing to look closely enough, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, those truths find their way back into the light. Mara often thought back to that quiet afternoon in the attic, sitting on the dusty floor with a stranger's photograph in her hands, feeling an inexplicable pull to understand who he was and why he mattered. She was deeply thankful, looking back, that she had trusted that feeling rather than dismissing it. Because sometimes, the most important truths are hiding in the most ordinary places. A box in an attic, a loose floorboard beneath a bed, a single photograph tucked quietly among dozens of others, waiting patiently for 60 years for someone to finally ask who the stranger in the family photograph really was. If you enjoyed this story, and you would like to hear more real and true-to-life mysteries uncovered through old family secrets, forgotten letters, and long-buried truths, consider subscribing to this channel for more stories just like this one. There are more hidden histories waiting to be told, and more families out there with stories every bit as powerful as Mara's, simply waiting for someone willing to open the box and ask the right questions.